is Kamputa, and then the highest level of achievement that you can acquire in our shul is to get behind the counter on the Simple Kiddush. I mean that's like completely out of reach. But maybe one day I'll be able to find out where the Kamputa office went to. Okay, Gavalting. So let's learn the Helig Gemara. I believe that today might be the yahrzeit of Rav David Kronglass. I believe it is. It's the yahrzeit of the Mishkiach of Baltimore. So I believe it's his yahrzeit. Today is the 11th day of Tammuz. Yes, it's Rav David Kronglass's yahrzeit. And it's a Shlomo Egri, the Gilui Mashal yahrzeit. It's supposed to be walking alone. I don't know a lot of Torah or David Kronglass, but I always share over the same word many times. Whenever people want to make judgment calls and talk about the chet of people who are well beyond our imagination, Rav David Kronglass was once asked by a Talmud, I don't understand what the big affair of Yaakov was that he didn't let his daughter marry Esav. Who would? So the Bali Musar answers is, of course, he shouldn't have let his daughter marry Esav. But when he put her in the box to hide her, he did it with too great enthusiasm. So his Talmud asked him, I don't understand what's the big affair. Abdullah Kronkel said, take this as a lesson, that anything that you could appreciate is something that's wrong to do, Yaakov Avinu would never have done. So it makes sense that what Yaakov Avinu is getting punished for is something that you don't even sense that it's an affair. Because in fact, if you could figure it out, Yaakov Avinu would have figured it out as well. Okay, so yesterday we learned about the shaila if someone said Kaim Lechi, Mufar Lechi. So we said if it's Kaim Lechi Yoim, Mufar Lechi, Lamocher, so Kaim Lechi, Mufar Lechi doesn't work because we already said Kol Sheina Bezach Hazeh, Eina Bevasachas. If he said Kaim Lechi Yoim, Mufar Lechi, Lamocher, it doesn't work because the Hafar doesn't work because there's a problem of its past expiry date. And the question was Kaim Lechi Shah, so Kaim for an hour, and then Hafar afterwards. There the Gemara had a shaila, and the Gemara ended up with a not a takeout, but the Gemara didn't answer the shaila. So the Ran says that we go l'chum. That was the first half of what we did yesterday, and the second half of what we did yesterday was the Mishnah reiterating that if the father dies, whatever koyach the Baal needs from the father to be mefer, he would not get, and therefore the Baal alone would not be able to be made for the nether. However, if the husband dies, then the father would in fact be able to make for the nether in most cases. And the Gemara said that in that way, the Av has a stronger grasp in the Nedarim than the husband, the Baal. However, in one certain respect, the Baal has more koyach because the Baal, even though he's only an Urus and she's an Arusa, he could be made for her Nedarim after she becomes a Boigris, but the father cannot. So I think we need to clarify that even though a Baal could be made for when she's a Boigris, I believe he still needs the Av, and since the Av is not there, there is no Hafar possible. Only once she's in the Suah can the Baal be made for when she's a Boigris, but then he would have been able to be made for anyway. And the Gemara tells us the reasons how we know, and this is going to be very important for today. How do we know that the Av could be mefer and he gets back the schos from the Baal when he dies? Because the pasuk says, we make a hekesh from her situation before she marries her first husband to after she marries her first husband. Before she married her first husband, her father exclusively was able to be mevatel of her nedarim. So too, if her first husband dies and now she's single again, the father could now be made for her nedarim without the husband. However, we don't extend that courtesy to the husband because it says binureh beisavia, any nedarim that she has from binureh remains with the control of beisavia even after he dies, and therefore the Baal would not be able to be made for it. What's going to be relevant today is when the Gemara learned from being makish koid mavai rishona to koid mavai shniya, the Gemara asked, maybe the only types of Nedarim that the father could be made for on his own are Nedarim Shaloi Nir La'aris. Nedarim that the Aris never knew about, and therefore he never grabbed the control over it. But Nedarim Shenir La'aris, how do you know that if the Aris was aware of it and now he sort of grasped onto it? How do you know if the Aris dies, even those Nedarim can exclusively be hufar by the father? Zakta Gemara, because I wouldn't need the hekesh of Kaid Mavaya Rishayna, the Kaid Mavaya Shniya, because for that I have been a Rebbe Savia. Any Nedarim that are only with the father, we already know the father could be made for it without any help. We only need this extra hekesh of the makish, Kaid Mavaya Shniya to Kaid Mavaya Rishayna, to tell us that even the Nedarim that were near La'aris. So we know for a fact from this limud that even the Nedarim that were near La'aris, meaning they were made during the Aris's life, and the Aris found out about it, even such Nedarim, should the Aris die, the father could still be made for them exclusively. And then we had a little discussion about boigris yesterday, and we learned a very important halacha that boigris has a limitation, and that is if she made a neder when she was a naira, and then she became a boigris, that neder the husband will not be able to be made for. The husband could only be made for a neder that she made when she was a boigris, and he could only be made for it after he's at the point where he's supporting her. Once he's supporting her, if he's paying her credit card bill, then he could be made for her nedarim. So we said that at what point after erison does the husband have to pay her expenses? It's anywhere between 30 days and 12 months, because of the cheshbon that we had, that once a boigris is already 12 months after she became a boigris, then even after 30 days after the kedushin, the husband is mechuyev to support his wife. Okay, that took us to the end of yesterday's sugya, which now takes us to the beginning of a sugya, another little bit complicated sugya. So the only hanacha that I want to take with us from yesterday that will be relevant for today is once we know that a father will be able to be made for the nedarim of his daughter on his own, once the husband dies, our Gemara makes it clear that it doesn't matter if the husband was aware of the nedarim or if he wasn't aware of the nedarim, if he grasped them, if he didn't grasp them, it's irrelevant. We have psukim to teach us that regardless, once the husband dies, the father could be made for those nedarim. Okay, let's see the Mishnah Vayta. Nodra, the Arusa. She made a neder and she was an Arusa. And Niskar Shabai B'yoim. And that very same day, she divorced. And the Ram's going to tell us this is relevant because the 24-hour period where we say not responding is a kiyum has not yet expired. Or Nisar Shabai B'yoim, or and Nisar Shabai B'yoim. So she got divorced from her first husband and got married to her second husband, Boy B'yoim, that day. Afilu Lameya, even if she was divorced by 100 men in one day, and she was married, but 101st man, nevertheless, Avia Ubayla Ha'achrain Mafir Nidareha. Any neder that she has, the Av cannot be made for on his own, and the Baal cannot be made for on his own, but they'll be made for it b'shutas. Zaklal, this is the rule. Kol shalayotzer lushus atzma sha'achas, until she becomes emancipated from her father's control, Avia Ubayla Ha'achrain Mafir Nidareha, when she's an Arusa, the afar only works with a combined effort of the father with the husband. Let's see the round. Nodra v'Arusa, Avia Ubayla Ha'achrain Mafir Nidareha. The Arus Meifar B'Koidmin B'Shutfus. We already learned that even though these Nedarim might have preceded this marriage, it doesn't matter, because since it's being done with the Shutfus of the father, any neder made after the father was born will surely not predate the father. And through his Shutf, he's also going to be able to be made for those Nedarim as well. Why did it have to be the same day? We're referring to a case where the Oris heard the neder. If the Oris heard the neder, the clock started to tick. The Shama Oris or Shama Ab, or the father could have heard it. But if either one heard it, then on them the clock starts to tick. That's why we need the hafara that day. If they heard about the nether right away, and there was no hafara until the next day, because the marriage, the marriage of the Baal who ends up doing the hafara isn't until the next day, that wouldn't work. The kivin the shama chad minayu v'loy hafar, because if we waited for any hafara, whether it's for the Baal's hafara or whether it's for the father's hafara, if 24 hours transpired and no one did a hafara, kaimel nidra, that would translate into a kiyum. With the Gemara sheklina v'tarina and hai minayu shama oros ayavia. Clearly, the fact that the Mishnah says that you have a 24-hour deadline, clearly one of these two must have heard about it, and it's that one that has to be made for within the 24-hour period. Which one in particular our Mishnah is referring to, that will come out in the Gemara. Zakla, which means shaloi bagra or vilanisis. There's two ways for a woman to become emancipated from her father's control. Either she becomes a full adult, she becomes a boigress, or she does nisuin. Those two items individually, independent of one another, would remove her from her father's control. If that didn't happen, then we still need the input of the father as well as the input of the husband. The bagra inisis, because if one of these two things happen, yatzar mishusav, and now ba'aris l'chudei le'matzi mefer. We know an aris cannot be mefer on his own. So if she's still in the rishus of the father and the father's not around for whatever reason, like she's a bagra, then the husband cannot be made for. And even if she was nisis, the husband can't be made for if it was a nether that pre-existed in this. Okay, Gavalta. Good morning. Okay, we're looking at another difficult Gemara today. We're going back and dipping our toes into that complicated Gemara with the Megas guys and Nicholas Kolish. So that's why it automatically gets a little bit confusing. So the only baggage that I felt we need to take with us from yesterday is that we learned yesterday that we had a limud to teach us that the father is still able to be made for her nedarim, even without the help of the Baal, if should the Baal died. So she became an arusa, and she made a neder, and then the husband dies, the father alone could still be made for her nedarim. And we learned that because there it says where just like Kodim Mavaya Rishona, when she was single, the father himself was able to be made for her nedarim. So to Kodim Mavaya Shnia, when she loses her first husband and she's not single again, the father can still be made for the nedarim on his own. So that's an important piece of information. That there's no difference whether or not the first husband had a connection to those nedarim or not. Either way, once the first husband is no longer in the picture, the father could be made for the nedarim by himself. The Gemara, Minolon, the Aris Achron, made for nedarim, Shenir Aris Rishon. How do you know that the Aris Achron could make for nedarim that were nearer to the Aris Rishon? So before we even move, we need to ask whoever said that. Where did the Mishnah say that the Aris Achron is made for nedarim that the Aris Rishon knew about? It doesn't say that. Can you explain what you're referring to?
The question is
that the Aris Achron is made for nedarim Shenir Aris Rishon. Maybe
you can do it to the other. Why can't you do it?
No, maybe if there were nedarim that happened during the marriage of the first Aris, and then the Aris dies, or the Aris divorces her, maybe now the father himself does it, and he doesn't need the second Aris. Who said the second Aris takes over? Maybe the Av is now going to be made for her nedarim exclusively. That's the question.
Isn't that what the
I'm sorry?
Isn't that what the Mishnah said?
Well, that's precisely what I want to highlight. It says Nadra v'arusa, Nizgarsha b'aviyim, Nizgarsha b'aviyim, Afilu l'meya, Avia ubayla achem nefir nedarim. So that could be speaking where the Aris never knew about it. How do you know that this is even if the Aris knew about it?
Nero, I thought that means that it happened during the
No, Nero means they became aware of it. So if maybe Amish if he didn't become aware of it, so then the second husband became aware of it. So now the second husband controls this nether. So surely you need his hafara. But what happens if the first husband already had it? Maybe the second husband doesn't get it. Maybe the moment the first husband dies, the father seizes it. And we know until she remarries, for sure the father could do it on his own. So how do we know that changes? So that's the question. But the problem is, I'll ask you a better question. We know that that's what the Mishnah means. So Zokt to Ram, in fact, we don't know that this is what the Mishnah means. This is Shmuel's own Chiddush that he heard from his Rebbe, and he's just trying to say, how do we know, where did the Torah say the Chiddush that I didn't find in the Mishnah? Where does the Torah say the Chiddush that my Rebbe taught me how to understand the Mishnah? And my Rebbe told me, Zok Shmuel, that Nodra, the first husband knew about it, and then the first husband dies, that would not require the afar of the second husband. I'm sorry, that would require the afar of the second husband. That's the Chiddush of Rebbe that it would require. How do I know that it does require? So let's see again. Minalan da'aris achron mei for nedarim shenir laris rishon. Amar Shmuel, Amar Kra, Shmuel says it says Nazar Pasuk. So the Ran once again says that this is all Shmuel talking. This Minalan is not asking on the Mishnah, because the Mishnah never said that. It's Shmuel who says this. And the Ran proves that that must be the case. A is because he asked the Kasha, where do you see this in the Mishnah? But the Gemara is going to bring later on a Tanya Kavasei to Shmuel, and that Brisa, if Shmuel's Chiddush is only the limud from the pasuk, but the Mishnah already says the halacha that the Aris Achron is mefer, then the Tanya Kavasei to Shmuel should have to prove that we learned it from the pasuk, because that's all Shmuel said. But the Brisa actually just tells us the halacha that you need the input of the Aris Achron. Doesn't tell us the Makar. So obviously the Chiddush of Shmuel is that fact, that if the Aris Rishon knew about the nether, then the Aris Achron is still needed to be made. And Shmuel is on his own offering a pasuk. Amar Kra, it says in the pasuk, and she already has pre-existing conditions. And we learn Nedarim shahayu aleh akfar. So you see over here that when she married her second husband, even though there were Nedarim on her from the previous husband, it still requires the hafar of the second husband. That is the Makar according to Shmuel. Frankly, more, how do you see that from the pasuk? How do you know when the pasuk says it's referring to Nedarim that were already active and were known about by the first husband? Maybe the first husband didn't know about it, and only there do we say that the second husband is required. But if the first Aris knew about it and he already grasped it, maybe then the Aris Achron won't. Maybe the Aris Achron cannot be mefer. Because it says Allah. When the Allah, the extra word Allah tells us that Allah, even though these Nedarim were from the time of the first husband was aware of them, nevertheless, the second husband could need to be made for them as well. Allah Kra Yisera. Okay, let's just do a quickly look at the round. Mino Hanamili, the Aris Achron made for Nedarim Shanir Larishon. The Midah Katani Nisgar should boy beyoim. It's also boy beyoim al Karchach B'Sham Maskim. So right away in the Mishnah we said someone must have known about it because the clock started to tick. It had to be boy beyoim. Diloi boy beyoim lamali. Now the Mishnah could be speaking where the father heard about it, and the father is the one who has to have the safar completed within a day. So therefore, there is no raya from the Mishnah to what Shmuel is even arguing. When he did the maybe only the father heard about it. And therefore it says because the father has to make his afara within 24 hours. But if the first Aris heard about it, maybe the Aris Achron cannot be made for such an ether. So even though you don't see that from our Mishnah, Shmuel Kibla Meirabba, he was makabel from his Rebbe. The Chitana by B'Yom, when our Mishnah says by B'Yom, it's Mishum Shmias Oris Tanalei. It's because the first Oris heard about it. And the Mishnah states that even though the first Oris heard about it, if the woman remarries, we require the hafara of the second Oris to be made for this nether. Right? Correct. Because the first Irish heard about it, so the clock is ticking. And that's why Shmuel was asking on his own Chiddush that he said, shot in the Mishnah, from his Rebbe, how did my Rebbe know this? So he's not asking, how do I know that the Mishnah says this? He's asking, how do I know that my Rebbe said was correct? That's not a general question that the Gemara is asking, that Shmuel comes to answer. It's part of Shmuel's words. It's all part of his chiddush that he's saying pshat in the Mishnah. Normally a person would say pshat in the Mishnah and then prove it. The way he entered the discussion, how do I know that that's pshat in the Mishnah? Yeah. So it's like when Moshe Blessing starts a story, he usually starts like in the middle of a dramatic scene. So Shmuel did the same thing. Omar Hachi, Omar Shmuel. It's as if this is what happened. Omar Shmuel, we know Hanamili, how do we know the Aris Achrain May for Nedarim Shanir Larisha? How do I know that? Because I know that from my Rebbe. And you find that the Gemara sometimes presents information in this fashion because u'takavasa reish perik elu metzius kavet peris mefuzarin techama amir abitcha kaved al ramais u'muchachasam derbitzach kufei baile. It's Rabbi Yitzchak asked the question, and Rabbi Yitzchak was answering his own question. It wasn't the Gemara asking the question, and then Rabbi Yitzchak responded. U'shmai tzanami muchacha the dina gufei shmul hu. It's also muchach from the Gemara later on that this is Shmuel's own halacha, and the lav raya de krabachud. And Shmuel is bringing more to the table than just the makar that he learned it out of the pasuk. Rather, the whole halacha is part of Shmuel's chiddush. How do I know that? The isa the dina b'masnisin who. If you're going to learn that this is what the Mishnah says, and that's not Shmuel's chiddush. And all Shmuel is bringing here to the table is not the halacha, just the pasuk to support the halacha, then it wouldn't make sense. Because heichi ma'isi tanya kavasa the Shmuel, how will the Gemara in the next step bring a right to Shmuel from the price of Naya Mirasa? That price doesn't show anything about the pasuk. If that's all Shmuel brought to the table was the limit from the pasuk, well then it would have to be illustrating a limit from the pasuk with the brisa, and the brisa says no such thing. So if a brisa the brisa doesn't bring the pasuk to illustrate this halacha. So obviously the halacha gufa is the chiddush of Shmuel, and we're supporting Shmuel's halacha by bringing the pasuk. The haydina lechazel Shmuel elamasnisinhi, and if in fact this isn't Shmuel's chiddush in the Mishnah, this is pachuk shot in the Mishnah. My ulma de brisa mimasnisin. If Shmuel held that this was Pasha Pshat in the Mishnah, why do I need to bring a raya from a brisa? He has a raya from a Mishnah. Elamai, it's not apparent at all in the Mishnah, and Shmuel's chiddush is to say Pshat in the Mishnah, and the brisa supports Shmuel's Pshat in the Mishnah. And the part that he brought from the pasuk is a cherry on the top. This whole halacha is Shmuel's chiddush, and he did Tani Le'amasnisim, even though he's learning it into the Mishnah as Pshat. The Mishnah you would be able to explain in a different fashion that it's speaking where the father himself heard. That's why we bring right from the brisa, because the brisa is much more explicit that this is in case the halacha that if the first husband heard about it, for sure you need the input of the second husband. Okay, Givalti. Now we're going to bring the raya to Shmuel. Tanya kavasei to Shmuel. This is going to be a little bit complicated, but what I'm going to do, again, I'm going to try to simplify it to make it as simple and as easy as possible. And then, if we have time, we'll learn the long run. Because once again, the other base only has like 4 lines on it, and it's all around. So let's see what we have. Tanya kavasei to Shmuel. Naira hamu'urasa ovia ubaila mafir nidarim. We know that Anaya Mirasa is a joint effort to be made for between the father and the husband. Ketzad, let's get into the details. As usual, the devil is in the details. Shama Avia Lahafrela. The father heard about the nether, and he was made for the nether in the lifetime of the father, of the husband. The husband never heard about it. Ad Shemes. The husband died. So there's a farah from the father, which remains standing, and the husband then dies. V'nisarsa boy b'yoyim, and now she becomes nisarsa another day.
Same day.
Could I just finish the case? The Sasa by Biyom, she becomes out the same day. Vafilu may upon him. This was a very busy day. This is basically a father who's desperate not to make the Sudas Nasuim go to waste. So he's trying to get a chasna in, so at least the big wedding that they paid for won't go to waste. Right. Don't worry about that. Vafilu may upon him.
Not
Vafilu may upon him. Avia ubayla ha'achron mafir nidara. Her father and the last Baal is made for nidar. Okay, so that is the first halach. From here we don't really see anything because this is speaking right? We're looking for a case if the Baal did hear about it, right? That you need a second husband. Here, if the Baal did not hear about it, you require the second husband. So this is not what we're looking for, right? Now there is a question that the Ran raises. How is it that the Baal HaAchron is able to yarshin this nether? Well, let's think about it according to Basila. The father was made for the nether, right? So if you hold Miklish Kolish, there's very little nether left because the father was made for the nether where the husband didn't even hear about it. So the husband had barely didn't have a grasp of the nether yet. So when the father was made for the nether, it was come out obliterated, right? Now that the husband dies, how could the next husband yarshin it? There's nothing to yarshin. We said that if she didn't remarry, we learned in the earlier brisa, in the last complicated brisa, that if the father was made for her nether, the husband didn't know about it, and then the husband died, the father cannot continue the affair after her husband dies. Remember, Beis Hillel said that if the father was made for the nether, the husband never knew about it, and then the husband dies, and she's single, the father cannot be made for the nether. There you don't say this right now. And the reason that we learned was because there's so little nether left, it's not transferable. So the question is, we know it's not transferable to the Av, but then how is it transferable to the next husband?
Wasn't it the Shammai?
No, that was Basil. Basil said Miklish Kolish, and therefore you couldn't. And the Rai says, Rav Nosson said that by Shammai holds, the father can still be made for because it's Megas guys. Whatever the father took away, he took away. Whatever remains was a full intensity. But according to Basil, the whole nether is becoming so weak, the father can't yarshin it. It's no longer shreiknet. So the father can't yarshin it. How can the next husband get it?
So this price contradicts that?
No, it doesn't. The Ran tells us an important chiddush that we learned, that there's a difference between the shreiknet and Rishus La'ab, where the father's yarshining it. There has to be a transfer of assets to the halacha that the second husband stands in the shoes of the first husband. There's no Yerusha. You learn from the Hekesh of Makish, Havaya Shnia, Lavaya Rishoina, that it's like a power of attorney. It's like he stepped into the feet of the first husband, and therefore it doesn't need Yerusha. So even though it's weak, he could still get in there. Let's see, I don't know in the whole right now. So, Veneer Be'enai. I'm not sure if you could see where it's about 10 lines up from the bottom in the center. Veneer Be'enai. Lefi. Devrayim Zal. The Hainu Taima Mishum Delail, the Iko Shina Rishus. In the earlier case, where we need control of the nether to transfer from the deceased husband to the father, the mantik lay high nidara the aris la'av. In order for such a transfer to occur, kol heicha the kolish lay motzi mantik. If the nether becomes so weak, there's not enough intensity of nether to be transferred. Aval hacha the ika aris achrin. But when the aris achrin shows up on the scene, it's not a transfer like an estate transfer. Rather, we literally look like he stepped into the feet and took over the Kari Rishon. And since the koyach of being made for the nether is transferring from Aris to Aris, even though it's very weak and it normally wouldn't be able to transfer to a Yerusha, that's not called a transferring of rishus. That's just the second husband is stepping into the shoes of the first husband. So that explains how the first case works. Now we're going to get to the second case. And I'm explaining this the way the Ran learns, which is the first half of the Ran and Amud base. Second half of the Ran and Amud base is going according to Tosfos' track, which is completely different. Shama Baila. So from the first case, you don't have any raya that's relevant. You don't have any raya that's relevant to our shaila, because our shaila is bedafka where it's hispik abal l'shmoy. That's number one. Number two is there's going to be a machlokes b'shama and b'silo in this next case. The Ran learned that machlokes does not apply to the case that we just learned. Everybody, both b'shama and b'silo, agree to this halacha we just learned. Now, shama baila, v'hafar law. What if the husband heard that he was mefer? So now clearly the Baal was very much aware of another who was actually mefer. Well, he's because av l'shmoya achemesa Baal. And the father didn't hear about it, achemesa Baal. So in both cases, it's the husband that dies, not the father. But in this case, it's the husband who made the hafara. So then, chayzer av umefer chelka shabal. Now the father takes it completely over, as the Ram explains. Even though it was weakened because the Baal was already made for it, but once the Baal dies, his afar is gone, and therefore chayzer av umefer chelka shabal. The Ram adds a little bit more information, and he says, "I don't understand. If there's another Baal, why doesn't the second Baal get it?" Right? That's what we're going to have to explain. So we're going to see that in a second. Amr Abnosen, hey name Divrei Beis Shammai. This only works according to Beis Shammai. And the Ram explains why does it work according to Beis Shammai? Because Beis Shammai holds megas gaius. And therefore he learns something very interesting. He learns something very the Baal was made for the nether in his lifetime. All right? But whatever the other half of the nether remains with its full intensity. But when the Baal dies, his afar disintegrates. So if his afar disintegrates, so then why doesn't whatever he had in it go transfer to the second Baal, and then the second Baal should still be required? Why does Beis Shammai say here the Av could do it on his own, even though there's a second Baal here? Zok Ran Chiddush. He says, since the first husband discharged all of his responsibilities regarding this nether, he was made for it. Right? If you held Miklish Kolish, then he didn't really discharge all of his responsibilities, because even what he did isn't really effective because there's still the full nether there, it just weakened. But if you hold Megas guys, that means this first husband completely discharged whatever necessary, whatever he was relevant to this nether, he's done. So now he's out of the picture. Since he's out of the picture, there's nothing left to go to the second Baal, and therefore Beis Shammai learns that once this Baal dies, now the father's completely in charge. That's the chiddush of how the Ran learns the subject.
Even if there's no second Baal.
That's right. Well, if there's no second Baal, it's pashut. Everybody agrees that Av takes over.
He's doing it mamash on his own. They don't do it with the husband.
Correct. Aval Beis Hillel ein yachal lahav. Beis Hillel holds that it would still require the input of the husband, and it would go over. The my plea, what is the machlokes? Beis Shammai Sabri, Nedarim Nami, Shenira La'aris, even the nether that was near La'aris, still Nisroikna Rishus La'av. Nevertheless, the Rishus gets transferred to the father. Why? Because we make his guys. Since the first husband totally finished anything that he needs to do with this nether, now that's it. There's nothing left here, only for the father. Even though the nether comes back the moment the Baal dies, but there's no Baal anymore here. Now everything here is left to the Av. But Beis Hillel Savri Avil Baila Achim Nedarim, because Veloy make his guys. He owes Miklish Kolish. So since the first husband is never out of the picture, even though he made the Afara and he did everything he can do, but he didn't accomplish everything because there's still the whole nether is still there. So therefore he's still connected. The Baal is still connected. The Baila Achron takes over that koyach, and we will still require the Baila Achron. So the way the Ran learns, the machloikis in the second case that we just learned is Beis Shammai holds that the Av alone will be able to be made for Nedarim. Beis Hillel holds that the Baal together with the Av is made for the Nedarim. And that's the raya. The raya is Beis Hillel holds that the Baal Achron is still needed. Since Beis Hillel holds that the Baal Achron is still needed, you have a clear raya that even though the husband died, when they remarry, even though the first husband knew about the nether and was made for the nether, we still need both, right? That's exactly what Shmuel's Kiddush was. But the Ran goes a step further. The Ran says even Beis Shammai is a raya to Shmuel. Why? Beis Shammai says in this case, the father alone is mefer. The teretz is this case is different than the case that we were referring to, because in this case, the reason why the father alone could do it, before I speak it out and I make a mistake, we'll actually look at that inside the Ran. So I'm 100% clear. So first, I want to just pick out the excerpt of the Ran, where the Ran discusses how it works with Megas Gaius according to Beis Shammai, and why is it that the father alone no longer requires the input of the husband. So Zok the Ran, Venirli, I'm on the second wide line of the Ran on other days. Venirli, the Hainu Taima, why according to Beis Shammai, if the first husband was made for his part of the nether, and then he dies, and then the wife remarries, you do not require the input of the second husband. The father alone could be made for the nether. Is Mishum Dul Beis Shammai the Svir Lumegas Gaius, since Beis Shammai was Megas Gaius, even the Chihal for a Baal, once the Baal made his afar, the first husband while he was alive, if the lay Palga the Nidra Lagam, he totally wiped out his half of the nether, which means Hare Ma'isa Shaloi Nigmar. That means he did his full thing, he discharged his full responsibility. The Stalik Le'aris Lagamri, now he's gone, he's done, he's out of the picture. There's no relevance to him in this nether anymore. Whatever he needed to do, he did it, and his nether is gone. Even though once he dies, before the father did his afara, the afara of the husband will also disintegrate because it never met its match. Since the Aris was removed from here with his afara, the Tzion of Tiksin is taluka yistalik. He's done, he's gone, he's over. He's not relevant anymore. This nether has no connection anymore to the first Aris. So therefore, the kamle av b'loy Aris. We perceive it as if there's an av here without an Aris. Even though she remarried, it doesn't matter, because anything related to Aris in this nether is no longer here. So that's the raya here. Gvaltik. I'm sorry? Right. Beis Hillel Savri, Beis Hillel holds, so I'm just skipping a couple of lines. Beis Hillel Savri, you still need the second husband, because the husband, the Baal side of this nether, is still very much alive and kicking. You know why? Because when there's a partnership, Beis Hillel holds that each partner doesn't totally eliminate a part of the nether. Even when the Baal made his afara, it didn't take away half the nether. It weakens the whole nether, but it's still very much there. So the Baal is still in the picture here. We don't consider weakening the intensity of a nether to be discharging completely your connection to this. There's no chalois of anything regarding the affair of this Baal, until the father, the other partner, joins him to eliminate the nether. Since in this case, the father was not made for it, he didn't hear about the nether until after the husband died. According to Beis Hillel, this Aris is very much in the picture. And that's why the Aris Achron is very much in the picture. And now let's look at how this is the raya. So I'm skipping down to almost smack in the center of this long ram. Umaisi mehach brisa tanina mehachi l'shmuel. And what is the raya from this brisa to Shmuel? Mishum de Beis Hillel. According to Beis Hillel, it's very simple. Ha'amri da'av ba'aris achron mafir nedarim shenir l'aris rishon. That's exactly what this case said. There was nedarim, there was a nether. The first husband was made for it. He clearly became aware of it. Then he dies. And what is the psak halacha according to Beis Hillel? That the Av together with the second Baal has to be mefer. That's exactly what Shmuel said. Problem is Beis Shammai didn't say that. Beis Shammai said the Av alone could be mefer. So how could you bring a raya from Beis Shammai to Shmuel? Zokteran vafilu Beis Shammai nami loy pligi. You know why Beis Shammai argues over here? Is ela b'sheshama b'ayla v'haferla. There's the Baal knowing about it, and then there's the Baal discharging his responsibility. In this brisa, the reason why Beis Shammai holds Megas guy is because the Baal didn't just hear about, he actually discharged his full responsibility and he destroyed it. But the case of our Mishnah doesn't say that there was any action done. Avol Shama v'lo yafar, but if he merely heard about it, but it wasn't made for it, so there he connected to it, he grasped it because he was aware of it, he just didn't make his afar there. There, even Beis Shammai would agree. So this is where the Rat is black and white, that it makes a difference if he was made for it or not. And Niru means just knowing about it, not even being made for it. This is what I think Pshat is. So just to do a quick review, Shmuel's halacha is that if there was a neder that was made during the marriage of the first Oris, and the first Oris was not made for it, and the first Oris dies, and then she remarries, the father cannot be made for it on his own. Whatever the first Oris's input was that was required to be made for this nether gets transferred to the second Oris, and now the father needs the second Oris to be made for it with him. And that's why it all has to be within 1 day, because the clock started ticking on the Oris's section. You don't get to, just because I'm the second Oris, I don't reset the clock from when I got married. The clock started ticking the moment the first Oris heard about it, and even if there's 100 weddings, I'll be done within that 24-hour period, because the Oris will only be able to be made for that nether if it was within 24 hours of when the first Oris heard about it, because it's the same account that expires, right? That's so. And what's the raya? The raya is from the case of the brisa, where in fact the husband not only heard about it, but was also made for it. According to Beis Hillel, even though the husband was made for it, it doesn't matter. He's still connected to it. And therefore, if this husband dies and she remarries, Beis Hillel paskins that we still require the afar of the second husband. So Beis Hillel very easily supports Shmuel. But even Beis Shammai, who holds that when the first Oris made his hafara, it eliminated any input of the Baal to be required for this nether. And therefore, when the Baal dies and she remarries, Beis Shammai holds the Av can still be made for the nether on his own. Even Beis Shammai would agree that if the first Baal was not made for the nether, that would require the hafara of the second Baal. And therefore, from both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, we have support to Shmuel's halacha that if a woman was married and she made a nether, she was an arusa and she made a nether, and then her husband died and remarried, the father does not get to keep the sole right to be made for Nedarim. Rather, we require the input of the Baal. And it's a chiddush, because she made a nether when she was an arusa. At that point, it required both the input of the father and her husband. But her husband dies. So now that she's an almana, before she remarries, everybody agrees the father could be made for the nether on his own. But he loses that. If she remarries, according to Shmuel's chiddush, now he loses that exclusivity, and now he has to come on to the Baal Hasheni again. I'm sorry? Even if who was made aware of it? Sure. Because it's not about him. It's about whether or not the Baal is still hanging on to some control. Him being aware of it maybe gives him control. But the Baal's control is always still there. That was the chiddush of Shmuel. Okay. So that's pretty simple. And when you learn the Ran inside, the Ran gets very complicated. Because the way I explained it was that the first case, everybody agrees to. The Shalom are not arguing. And there's only machlokes in the second case. Tosfos learns that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are arguing in both cases, and they have a completely different understanding of it. And Tosfos backs away from the svara. We said a very interesting svara earlier that the Ran says is that even if it's the weakest of Nedarim, it will still transfer from Baal Rishon to Baal Sheni, because that's not working with any type of Yerusha. That's because the Baal Sheni steps into his feet. Tosfos argues on that as well. So everything here that we're learning is according to the Ran. We're running late, so let's just quickly learn the next three lines. What happens if a husband hears that his wife made a nether and instead of being made for it or being mekayim, he says, you know what? I'm out of here. He gives her a divorce. Is that called shtika? And therefore, if he remarries her, he could still be made for it? Or is it like hakamadamit? I'm marrying you, you keep your nether. Right? And I'm out of here. So maybe if he remarries her, it's too late. He was already making it. And he took her back that day. If it's kishtikadami, well, the clock is still ticking. But he could still be made for the nether until the clock times out. The Amar kakamadami, but if the mere fact that he divorced her shows you keep your nether and I'm getting out of here, then even if he takes her back, he will not be able to be made for her. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll tomorrow.